I want to quickly talk about how to use your model, the model that comes into your view, and how to use some of the properties in your model to populate the contents of a table, an HTML table. To start out with, I want to show you what the model looks like. This is a model. All it has is its class called properties, or I'm sorry, a class called library. And all a model is a class. So this model is a class called library. It has 4 properties on it. The bottom 3 here are really easy to see. One's called the name property, one's called city, one's called state, and they're strings. So that means they're literals, or they'll be in double quotes. I set them just by default to nothing, an empty string, so that they're not null. And then this top property is a list of, or a collection of, book types. And I just called that list of book, I just called books. Now I could have named these things anything I wanted to, but I thought a collection of book or list of book would best be represented by a variable called books. And you can understand that in this metaphor, there's this, you have a library, and you have some books in that library. And a books is represented by a collection of single book. And the name of the library, the city, and the state that library might be in. And that information is being populated over here in my controller. This might look like a lot of code, but let's just walk through it. I have a home controller, and the home controller has one method in it called index. And what it does is it instantiates an instance of that library class. And then it sets the city and state properties to some specific values. I'm setting the city to Lincoln and the state to Nebraska. Then I'm continuing, I'm populating a book, one specific book. We didn't look at the book class, but it looks pretty generic. I'll open it up real quick. A book class just has a title and an author. And all I'm doing over here is setting that author to Steve and the title to a book called Steve is Cool. And then I'm adding that book. So I declared it as book 1. This is just the name I gave it. I set the properties on it. And then I'm adding that book to that collection of books into the library I instantiated. So again, up here we declared a library class. I called it my library. And then we set the city and state on it. But then we're also adding books to that library. I have this my library, something I called, it's of type library. It has a list of books, and we're adding book 1 to it. And we're kind of doing the same thing here. We have book 2. It's also of type book. Setting the author and the title, and adding book 2 then to the collection. So now there's 2 items in that collection. One book being added, a second book being added, and you can kind of see the same pattern, a third book being added, and a fourth book being added. And very key here, that entire library is being sent back to the view. And so if I go over to my view, I can see that my view is receiving that library type. I'm not necessarily using anything for that library in here. I just hard-coded in some words inside of my table. And so let's see what that looks like when I go to run it. I don't expect to see any of the values that I set. I just expect to see this table. So we'll see what that looks like. And I gave it some style just to see it visually. The table has a border, an orange pixel border, and it has 3 cells in it. But you can see where it says library name, library city, library state. We're going to replace those with the actual library's name and the library city and the library state. Now that I think about it, over here in my controller, I failed to do one thing. I actually failed to set the library's name. So before we can show that library's name, I need to set its name, and I'm going to call it our favorite library. That's the name of our library. And city and state is still Nebraska, and everything's still working like it was populated before. It's being returned to the view at the bottom. It's being returned back to the view. So over here in my view, I can see I'm receiving a library. And instead of using these values here in each of those cells, I'm going to replace them with values from my model. Model dot, and since my model is a library of type library, I'm going to go model.name, and I'm going to replace the next cell with model.city and model.state. Now this is, I see the yellow razor mark up here. This is saying, hey, I'm going to give some C# here, and from my model, the model coming in, which is of type library, because I can see it up here at the top, I'm going to show the name, the city, and the state. And those are just properties that exist on this model. Remember back here in our library class, we have name and city and state properties on our class called library. And up here, our class or our model is of library. And I can then access those properties on it. So if I go to run it, and I hit run, and waiting for it, you can see it replaced the name of the placeholder I had in there now says our favorite library, Lincoln and Nebraska, and that was getting it from what I populated over here. How is that happening? It's because it's populating the library, sending it back to the view here at the bottom, sending it back to the view, the entire library that has all 4 books in it, and it has these properties set on the library. And over here on the index page, I'm just accessing those libraries properties, model, name, city, and state, and I'm writing those out as HTML. Now if I look at the view source on this, you can see that I don't see any razor right here. I don't see at model.name. I see here on line 20, I see the actual name of the library that we set, the actual city and the actual state. Even though that was rendered by these lines over here, line 22, 23, and 24, this part gets rendered on the server, gets executed on the server before it gets spit out to the browser to become this text, and only Razor is doing that. So next question you might be wondering, well, how do I display the books, each specific book? And so in order to do that, we're going to write up a little bit more markup way up here at the top, and I'm just going to open up a Razor block, and I'm going to say, I'm going to create a new variable and call it book 1, and I'm going to say book 1 is equal to, I'm going to go to my model, and I'm going to get from my list of books, I'm going to get the first item in my list of books, which I know is going to be, and this is link, LINQ, that's helping me pull the first book out of my collection of books. And if I look at my home controller, the first book I added was Steve, or Steve, the book Steve is Cool. That's the first book I added to my collection of books. Right here, mylibrary.books.add is book 1 is gonna become that book. So over here in Razor, I'm gonna make a brand new row, and I'm gonna add 3 cells to it, 3 columns to it, and I'm gonna access my variable called book 1. Let's do author, and book 2, or book 1, I'm sorry, let's do title, And here I'm going to put nothing. I'm going to leave it blank. So what I expect to see is I'm going to expect to see the row that we have the name and the city and the state. Now I'm going to expect to see another row in my table that has the name of the author for book 1 and the title for book 1. So let's go ahead and run that. So I can see I have a second row, and I'm accessing the model properties off of my model. Even though I have book 1 over here and book 1 here, that's just coming from the fact that I declared a book 1 using my model. So I just declared a variable, a local variable called book 1, got it from my model, and then I'm using book 1 down here, using that local variable. And this just becomes a book. In fact, if I could make this explicit instead of just var, I could call this book. Book 1, and I probably need to bring in a using statement. I'm probably missing a using statement, but just for the purposes of keeping it simple, I have book 1, which is going to be of type book, is coming from my model, which has which is a library, has a collection of books on it. I'm getting the first book using link, and then I'm writing out, I'm using book1.author to put those into the cells in the table. Let's get the last book and do another example. Var book2 equals model.books. So I'm pulling from the books collection again, that list of books, dot last or default. This will give me the last one. And if I look over my home controller, the last thing I populated was this book 4. And I could have called this book 4 right here. I can still call this anything I want. This could be Caitlin's book. Caitlin's book. Because for the simple fact I know that the last book we populated is this one. We added it to the library of books last. So when this code goes to run, it's going to give me the last book in my list. And then I'll just use that again. I'll make another row in code, and instead of book 1, I'll call it Caitlin's book dot author, and the same thing for the title. This is just a local variable to my page. It's not necessarily on my model. I just happen to grab it from my model. And then I'll go ahead and save this and refresh over here. And I can kind of see that I've got the last book. So you can see how to use items in data coming from your model to populate cell data in your table.